Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. We may step on a few toes through our examination of culture, art, politics, history, and identity. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Sigo, and welcome to Let's Talk Native. I'm John Kane. I'm your host. We've talked a lot on previous shows about identity and the struggles that exist for Native people on Native territories. I've talked about the fact that much of the poverty that exists on Native territories is policy driven. It's intentional. It's not a mistake. It isn't just because our people have lost some sort of will to thrive in life. By removal and policies related both at the state level and the federal level that have essentially stifled economic development and of course just the sheer remoteness of Native territories. That may not seem like as big an issue today because of e-commerce and that kind of stuff, but by losing generations of potential economic development, it's a big hurdle to overcome. But what I wanted to talk about today is related to that because, as I've talked about missing and murdered Indigenous women and substance abuse and suicide, as I've talked about all of the things that that ail our communities, all of the problems that we have in our territories, most of them, I'll take it back. Almost all of them are directly related to poverty, and a poverty, as I said, that's intentional. Now, not all of our territories have the same level of poverty as others, which is one of the things I want to talk about. But if we don't address the hopelessness that exists on many Native territories, even the ones that perhaps are not as impoverished, if we don't address the hopelessness that exists on many of our territories, we will never be able to tackle, the depression issues, the substance abuse issues, the flight from our territories. I mean, we lose probably among the more ambitious people on our territory. We lose them because they don't see opportunities on our territories. So they go out and they seek opportunities elsewhere. And of course, even if you're seeking things like education, if you're pursuing your a college degree or some other skill set, the chance of you bringing that back to our territories to create opportunity there or to realize the opportunity that you've now been educated for on our territories is slim. And because that's the circumstance, we never build more opportunities. So what I want to talk about is that fact that we must, and when I say we, I don't mean governments, I don't mean the state, I don't mean the feds, I don't mean Native governments. I mean we as people on our territories and the allies that we have and our people who don't live necessarily on territory. We've got to create hope. We've got to give our people hope on territories. And look, I know that sounds all, I don't know, it almost sounds new agey, I guess. But what I mean by that we must give hope, we must create opportunities. Now, again, as I said early on, the biggest problem is poverty. And one of the solutions to poverty is obviously money. So the idea that if our people had more resources, if our people were, and we're going to see, we see this with some of the stimulus money and that kind of stuff. And there, look, one of the guys who ran for president. What was the guy's name who was advocating a minimum or a Yeah, Yang, right. Andrew Yang was suggesting that there should be payments given to families. So there was a minimum income that we had, regardless of what other circumstances there are. And look, there's something to be said for that. Now, where do you come up with the resources to make sure that everybody has sufficient funding for their basic needs? If you're a territory that's impoverished, that gets complicated. But here's what I'll say. We know as Native people, as distinct as we might be from each other, and I know everybody throws out numbers of federally recognized tribes and that kind of stuff. Regardless of what the numbers are, we know there are some territories that are more affluent than others. And we have organizations like NCAI. There are AIM chapters. There's other Native organizations like USET. All of these organizations that are supposed to serve a larger group of Native people. If we aren't working either with these organizations or through the creation of new organizations to pool some resources to address the poverty on Native territories. And when I say address the poverty, yes, I'm talking about providing financial resources to those most in need, but also to create opportunities on the territories. Now, look, I know this is just talk, so it's easy to rattle the stuff off. But we do live in a world now that the remoteness of a territory doesn't necessarily preclude it from being able to have economic development. The proverbial, the world's become a smaller place because of the internet. That's true. But we have a lot to overcome. And one of the things that we haven't done adequately, and even in places that, where I've seen progress in terms of establishing and asserting our regulatory advantages over off territory, we haven't done a good job pooling those that information and the resources associated with that. Look, I know there's been studies. Joseph Kalt with the Kennedy School of Government out of Harvard. I mean, they've done, he did this whole piece on what tribes could do. And what he talked about was utilizing sovereignty as an asset. And that's really what I'm talking about here. When I talk about this notion of asserting and then marketing what our regulatory advantages could be on our territories, this isn't about leveling the playing field. This is about trying to give ourselves a competitive advantage. And look, that's the reason we have tobacco sales and fuel sales and even gaming on our territories is because we pushed before, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act and certainly there's nothing that's come from the federal government or the state government that's supported or encouraged our exploitation of our tax advantage. But we need to do that. And we need to be to fight for those things definitively enough so that we can market that. And I don't mean just market sell ourselves out, to some higher bidder out there. But I'm saying that we need to create the opportunities on our territories based on the fact that some of these things can only happen on our territories. I mean, one of the things that I even suggested here in Seneca territory, and I'm not Seneca, so I won't be the one to ever do this. But one of the businesses that has thrived over the years has been self-storage, and yet there are no self-storage units on Seneca territory. And I'm thinking, if a Seneca wanted to do something on their lands that would be more profitable on territory than off territory because of property tax, because of all of the income tax, state income tax, all that stuff. Look, a Seneca could actually build these self-storage units, and that income would be completely untaxable because it's income generated from the land, and that's not just a farm income. That's things like lease. So, I mean, there would be a clear example of a business model that is not tobacco, it's not fuel, and it's not gaming, that would show a distinct advantage for that kind of development on territory. And look, it's not a big job creator, but it could be it could stimulate some work. Now, the customers and the clientele might be off territory, and I think when we have native territories that are close to urban environments, it's easier to look at that kind of stuff. When you talk about remote territories, when you talk about places like Pine Ridge or any of these places that are very, very remote and very, very impoverished, that may seem more difficult. But there are other services, there are other products, and there are things that we could do that do take advantage of the fact that the internet has made other businesses possible. And look, I'm not suggesting a specific answer here. I'm mostly putting out the call for what we need. And what we do need is we do need economic development in our territories. We need to both have the money to spend and the place to spend it. So if I look at, again, going back to this, to the relationships that could exist from territory to territory, then I start to ask the question, why isn't there a bigger effort to, to call upon not the states and the federal government, but other native territories that have more affluence? And there are. Look, and we've heard all the stories of some of the quote unquote gaming tribes that that are where each individual within their nation is have essentially been turned into millionaires, and whether and that's not an overarching experience that exists in most native territories. Most native gaming is not that lucrative. I mean, it does become the means of public finance for many native territories. But look, we told the story of the Osage and how affluent they lived at the turn of the 20th century because of oil revenue. There are many different ways that native territories that have had more affluence have developed that affluence. The question is, how can we pool some of those resources to help those that are most in need? And by doing that, we not only help those that are most in need, but we developed a tighter network amongst ourselves. Because, when we talk about unity, and that sounds great. I mean, it does. But the reality is we do all have different, we're distinct. We all have different parts of our culture, and we all have, different goals and aspirations. But there are certain things that we do have in common. And I think we need to find, and I've talked about this before, find that common ground. So when we do that, we may find solutions to some of the common problems that exist. And maybe not every territory has the same level of poverty, for instance, or joblessness, or and of course the ills that come with that. The suicides, the exodus of our population, and the substance abuse issues. But if we don't create first the opportunity for people to basically live. Look, I don't understand how you can have a territory that has an extractive industry, especially related to things like fuel, and yet you still have people freezing to death because there's not a program to make sure that their electricity stays on, or that their propane or their heating oil stays on or stays full. There, when I talk about putting money in the hands of people, I mean, the first thing is to make sure that the basic necessities are met. Heat in the wintertime, food. We don't have large food banks on our territories. We don't have many of the things that people can associate with populations, like urban populations. So, and why not? We certainly could, and we should. And I think there is help out there. And I'm not suggesting that we can't tap into state or federal funds, but I'm saying we need to be the solution, even if we're calling on or forcing the state and feds to fund some of it. But here one of the problems that exists here is that there ends up being some animosity that is held by the outside if they feel like native people are getting something that we don't deserve. Well, first off, let me back way up and address how it is that we got to where we're at. And and this is, I bring this conversation up into everything, whether I'm talking about the mascot issue or whether I'm talking about any of the ills that we're faced with. We've experienced generation after generation after generation of taking from our people, taking of our lands, taking of our lives, taking of our culture. This is what we've experienced. And the so-called trust responsibility that the United States, claims that they were going to provide for Native people, and part of that deal, the reason the United States views this as a trustworthy is because of the land cessions that took place. Native people never got paid just outright for our lands. Much of that land was lost through fraud and deception, but there was always a promise. There was always a promise that our people would have their needs fulfilled. Because look, the United States knew that our livelihoods, our success in life was tied to our lands. And the whole idea of changing our lifestyle so we were not dependent on large swaths of land for game or for gathering or whatever else. The whole idea was to limit how much land we had and encourage us to live like white people. Assimilation wasn't a choice. It was an imposed. Look, many people come to the United States, come to our lands. They come with this hope of the American dream, that yes, they're going to come and they're going to become Americans. So whether it's from Asian populations or European populations or African populations, whatever. Many come with this idea that there's this American dream and that they can become a part of the American system. And they will become Americans. That wasn't the choice that was given. That I don't want to take it back. Not given. That wasn't a choice that we had. Assimilation was forced upon us. Through residential schools. Through, obviously when you think about the massacres and the murders and all the things that our people experienced. Part of the reason our people enlisted in the armed forces in the numbers they did. That was part of this idea of trying to endear ourselves to the oppressive nature of the United States. So assimilation wasn't just something that wasn't just imposed upon us. It seemed for many Native people as the only recourse and the only way that we could see what other people had done in terms of fighting for this American dream thing. So, but it's an imposed policy. By many regards, the whole idea of the reservation system, it was developed first to push us out of the mainstream population, to isolate us. And in that isolation and in that desolation and in that despair associated with poverty, that we essentially would cease to exist. There were actually programs that were designed, and look, we know of the 5 policies, extermination and assimilation, termination, all of the removal, and of course what they call now self-determination. But along with those lines of self-determination was a bigger emphasis on assimilation. But as much as there was this policy of removing us from the areas that white people wanted, there was also another policy that developed during the Nixon administration, which was called a relocation policy. This wasn't removal in the same sense. This was the idea of getting our people off the reservation and into the cities. And the policy involved, sometimes, some level of employment and some level of housing in an urban environment. But the goal, again, was to cut the ties. It was to cut our cultural ties to both land and space and place, but also to family. So even though it's not sold that way, the way it's pitched is that, look, there's very little opportunities on native territories, so we're going to give you an opportunity off territories, which fed this idea of population flight from our territories. But there's very little that went back to bolstering. Part of the reason that AIM had its success was because it identified the urban populations and did as much as they could as an organization to ensure some of the some cultural support and support that would connect people back to the territories that they came from. But see, we live now where there's not a whole lot that connects us native people to native people to native territories. And powwows used to do some of that. And I'll admit, I'm not a big, huge fan of powwows. But one of the things that I acknowledge that it did is it brought our people together. So look, there is nothing wrong with Native people wanting their children to marry and build families with Native people. And I know we can get into a whole nother conversation about preferences, so to speak. And that's not the same thing as racism, but we've never really had a problem if a Native person from one Native territory, if our sons or daughters connect up with a Native person from another Native territory, even though policies sometimes are problematic in terms of, and tribal enrollment and even blood quantum can sometimes, come into the conversation. But we understood the value in maintaining that relationship, and although some families may have frowned when our sons and daughters married out of the Native culture, we looked at, even if it was a different Native culture, there was a real acceptance to that. But we don't have anything that encourages that. And in the absence of powwows, and now I think, beyond powwows, the role of these large gatherings of activism are among the only things that connect our people. In a place that are from different, where you come from a different place, and you go to a place and you connect with other Native people. Look, we have to have other reasons to get together than fighting a pipeline. By all means, let's get together and fight a pipeline. But we have to have other reasons to do that. Because, one of the problems that exists is when we do find ourselves in the role of activism, many of us know that we have to stay on task and focus. And as much as they may turn into somewhat social gatherings, those things can also be exploitive. So I think we do need to have social gatherings. But we also have to have reasons for our cultures to come together. Not to homogenize them, but to come together. So if trade and commerce is a part of that, then by all means. And look, to some extent, we've seen that with tobacco played a role in that. We know that there's some territories that played a role in developing brands, and those brands are sold almost exclusively on Native territories. So we've allowed that industry to give us some of that, but we don't do enough. So I think we have to look at what we can do on our territories. We need to develop and assert the regulatory advantages that we have in our territories, not because we want to exploit the environment or do something that some of the state or federal regulations are supposed to protect. We're not trying to do away with protecting our lands, but there's no need for some of the oppressive nature, and certainly taxes is one of the things that I'm talking about specifically. There's no reason that we can't create better environments that are not just geared towards quote unquote tribal governments developing economically, but that any of us can develop economically. And we need to know that if we build something on our territory, that we do have an advantage over off territory, not because it's going to necessarily, allow us to get bank financing and that kind of stuff. But that's the other thing that we need to talk about is how do we provide the resources to develop economically? Because we know we aren't going to qualify for bank loans, especially if we're exploiting a regulatory advantage that a bank may have a hard time, evaluating or legitimizing with financing. I mean, look, when we're fighting the state over taxes, it's a little hard to go to an agency that is, that the states have control over, and say, oh yeah, we're gonna open up a cigarette manufacturing facility, for instance, and then we still have this battle over, well, how much regulatory control will we still yield to the federal government, but we won't yield any of it to the state government. See, these things get complicated. But I think we should find out where the clear lines are and the things that we can do. And look, we understand that right now, gaming is one of the big industries that has impacted a lot of Native territories. Not all Native territories have gaming, and not all Native territories can have gaming because of the remoteness and the lack of patronage that can come from off territory. Because look, our gaming is only successful when the patronage is predominantly non-native. That's what brings money into our territories. We just can't circulate money back and forth within our territories if we don't have money that's coming in as well. And so that's why the sale of tobacco and fuel and all that stuff works on our territories. But we haven't expanded that enough. So these are the kinds of things that we need to promote. And I say this, and I know this turns into a trade and commerce conversation, but it still goes back to this idea that if we don't have something to offer our kids, our children, and in terms of prospects for the future, so whether it's a job opportunity or whether it's a career opportunity, and they're not necessarily the same thing, then what do we do to offer a child? What incentive is there for a child to pursue whatever type of education, whether it's standard high school and college education, or whether it's developing a skill set that could be marketable if we had something on our territories that could support that. Look, we know that our people are talented when it comes to things like creativity, music, the arts, theater. We could do all that stuff, but we don't have a whole lot of film production on our own territories. Just another thing I'll throw out there. But this is some of the conversation we need to have, because if we don't offer something for our young people, then what incentive is there for them to stay? And what incentive is there for them to improve themselves and to develop a skill set or a talent? And if they don't do that, then what we've done is we've created another generation of people who are really just struggling to survive and struggling with their identity, struggling with their existence. And that's a recipe for all the things that plague our territories: the suicide, substance abuse, depression, missing and murdered Indigenous women, all of that stuff. And of course, if the only thing that we can tell our kids is that you need to leave the territory, then that's what they do. And unfortunately, it's the most ambitious ones that we're encouraging to leave. So what we're left with on our territory are not the builders. They're not the creators. They are the ones who didn't have enough resources to even make that flight. So, I think it's really incumbent on us. If we're going to talk about activism, and I talk about that a lot on the show, if we're not going to be activists to provide hope for the next generation, for our own kids, if we're not prepared to build something, and I don't care where we've got to go, where we got to go for the resources, but we have to both get the resources and the plan. And look, it's easy to point to some of the most impoverished territories that really need this kind of help, but really every territory does, because even the most affluent territories that we have, there's still poverty that exists there. Even the most affluent gaming territories, there are Native people who are not enrolled that live on those territories, enrolled in their income distribution. So, we have to do something that goes beyond, and not to mention the fact that gaming is not recession proof, and it may not be sustainable. So if we don't diversify, what we're not only doing for public finance, but what we're doing to support our people and to support economic development in our territories, then we're in for a world of hurt. So I think it's really important that we, as the activist community, not tribal government, not state government, not federal government, but we as the activist community, we have to take a stronger stance on giving hope to the next generation. And if we don't do that, then we are failing our own children and we're failing our own grandchildren. And look, we can try to heal the hurt that's caused by suicide and drugs and all that stuff. But if we don't go to the underlying problem, which is that lack of opportunity, that lack of a prospect for the future, we'll never be able to tackle these social ills. I'm John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.